Many people believe that there's a tight connection between God and morality. Many people derive their morals from religion, and they think that it would be impossible for morality to be morality without God. So that is to say, if there were no God, then there would be no universal and real moral truths. For instance,
there is a very strong and important connection between morality and belief in God. And non-belief in God will indeed, over time, conduce toward a relativization of our morality.
If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And here's why. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of saying that something is really up or down. God's nature provides an objective reference point for moral values. It's the standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. But if there's no God, there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint. This kind of morality is subjective, not objective. It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream.
in this video lecture, I'm going to be arguing against these claims. So I think it's totally possible to have an objective basis for morality, even if God doesn't exist. And in fact, I think that the connection between God and morality, if he does exist, isn't even all that strong, and couldn't even be all that strong. So any theory that rests objective morality on God, I think, is fundamentally mistaken. Welcome to today's video lecture on the relationship between God and morality at Philosophy Jam. So, as usual, let's get a bit more precise about things. These sorts of ideas about there being a tight connection between God or religion and morality, they revolve around a theory called divine command theory. According to this view, moral truths are determined by God's commands. And an even better way of putting that is God's commands create moral truths. So let's look at the chart here. God might command, "Thou shalt not kill," as it's seen in the Ten Commandments. And the idea behind this view is that commandment makes it true that murder is wrong. When God commands that, it is made true that murder is wrong. Another command, though it's not one of the commandments, could be, "Do not torture." And if God commanded that, then torture would be wrong. So I've put a list of key words that really explain this tight metaphysical relationship between God's commands and moral truths, according to this view. So words that we can use to describe this relationship are as follows. God's commands make moral truths true, or God's commands create moral truths, or God's commands give rise to moral truths, or moral truths are explained by God's commands. Their truth is explained or accounted for by God's commanding the things that he does. And then finally, we could say that moral truths are true because God commanded them. So that first row of terms adequately describes this relationship between God's commands and moral truths, again, according to this view of divine command theory. It would be wrong, therefore, to describe this relationship as God's commands, for instance, aligning with moral truths, or God's commands telling us or guiding us or revealing moral truths. Those terms don't adequately describe the really tight connection between God's commands and moral truths, since those terms merely express alignment or a kind of epistemic guidance that God's commands offer on moral issues, right? We're not saying, as divine command theorists, that God's commands guide us or help us understand morality. We're saying something much stronger. We're saying that his commands literally create morality. So that's a really, really important difference. And I think a number of religions assume divine command theory to be true. That is, they think that God is required for morality. They think that he gives rise to morality, and without him, there wouldn't be any morality at all. So what we're going to be talking about today is whether divine command theory is true. It's the only theory that captures adequately, in my view, this really tight relationship between God and morality. And if it's false, then there's room for morality that isn't rooted in God. There's room for a kind of objective and universal morality that isn't brought into existence by God. Okay, so before we really start evaluating the theory, let's just suppose that it's true. I want to do an exercise on that supposition. So, supposing it's true, and supposing also you were God, what commands would you issue? What commandments would you make? What moral rules would you make? So please pause the video and write down like 5 commandments, 10 commandments that you would issue if you were in this position. Okay, I'm going to assume that you paused the video and you wrote down those 5 or 10. Now, think to yourself, why did you choose those commands in particular? Right, you're God. You could have chosen any commands. You could have made it immoral to grow plants in vases inside of houses. You could have made it immoral to own a table. You could have made a lot of things moral and immoral, right? So why did you choose the particular commandments that you did? Think again about that for a little bit. Pause the video and try to answer that question sincerely and thoroughly. I suspect that you picked the things on your list because you had good reasons to pick those particular things. You didn't make it immoral to own tables because there's no good reason to make that immoral. You may have made it immoral to kill or harm or torture other people. And I think that you did that because there's good reason to do that. Killing and harming and torturing people is bad for them, right? It introduces suffering and pain into the world. It prevents people from flourishing and being happy. So those sound to me like very strong reasons for a prohibition against torture or killing. And we can't provide those sorts of reasons in the case of owning tables or growing plants inside of your home. Those are perfectly innocent things to do. There's no good reason against them. So this brings us to the first major objection to divine command theory. And it actually goes all the way back to Plato. He wrote a dialogue called the Euthyphro. And there's kind of a lot going on in the dialogue, but one of the main questions that it investigates is the one we've been investigating now. where morality comes from and whether it's created by God or whether it has some other source. And what this exercise is designed to show is that it seems like even if God did command certain things to be morally true, he probably had good reasons for commanding those particular things to be morally true. That is, he chose for killing to be morally wrong. And if indeed he did all of that, he probably had good reason to. Killing harms people. It causes suffering. It ends a conscious existence. And it prevents the person who's dead from enjoying the good things that a life has to offer. So, either God based that commandment off certain reasons for why it's bad to kill people, or he just made it up and he didn't have good reasons to justify that commandment. Now, those seem to be exhaustive of the options, right? Either God had good reasons for prohibiting and for promoting certain things within a moral system, or God didn't have good reasons. And if he didn't have good reasons, then the commands would be totally arbitrary, like prohibiting people from owning tables. So, I hope at this point you can see why this is a problem for divine command theory. If God had good reasons for his commands, then those reasons alone seem to be enough to account for why the thing is bad. That is why, for instance, murder is bad, or torture, or killing, or harming other people. There's good reasons to not do those things. I've already listed them. So, those reasons in and of themselves seem to fully account for the wrongfulness of those sorts of actions. And so, God's commandment in itself, in this case, wouldn't account for the wrongfulness. God instead would be responding to the actually good reasons there are for not murdering. And in that case, God isn't really creating the moral rule, right? Maybe there's a sort of stamp of official approval that comes from his commanding something, but he doesn't make it the case that it's immoral to torture or murder someone. What makes it the case that it's immoral is that it's a bad thing to do. There are really good reasons against doing it. Immoral things cause suffering. They prevent human flourishing. They can deprive us from valuable conscious experiences. Those sorts of things fully account for the wrongfulness of most things. So it doesn't seem like we need God to make things wrong, because there are other things independent of God that make things wrong. And vice versa with morally appropriate or good things. Promoting human happiness and flourishing, I would argue, are good in and of themselves, and we don't need God to make them good in and of themselves. So, if those good reasons exist, then God would have based his commandments on them. And I hope that you based your commandments in the previous exercise on that sort of reasoning or that sort of foundation. So, in that case, it seems like divine command theory would be false. Now, on the other hand, God may have arbitrarily commanded certain things. That is, he may have not had good reasons for making certain things wrong. And now, that also seems problematic, but for different reasons. If God literally arbitrarily made certain things good or bad or right or wrong, then there'd be no justification for those things being good or bad or right or wrong. It would be like prohibiting the ownership of tables or the growing of plants indoors. They're stupid rules. There's no good reason for them. So, if this is true, then God would be making irrational choices. And that option doesn't seem appealing. It seems like theists especially would want to hold that God is perfectly rational, and he wouldn't make these sorts of arbitrary rules. So, this dilemma, as I was saying, goes all the way back to Plato in the dialogue, the Euthyphro. And here's a quote from Socrates, who's a character in the dialogue, that really captures the idea that I'm trying to express in this objection. Socrates says, "Is what is moral moral because the gods approve of it, or command it, or do they approve of it because it's moral?" And now I've substituted the word moral for holy. The original translation says holy or pious, but the basic idea is the same, right? These sorts of things are good, not because God commands them to be good. Rather, they are good, and so the gods, or God, approves of them. They have a certain intrinsic or independent goodness. At least that seems to be the best option. Now, let's get to another objection that may sort of further the point. So this objection has become known as the evil demon objection, and it's not to be confused with Descartes' evil demon when we were talking about skepticism a while ago. This is a different kind of evil demon. And I should say that a lot of this lecture is based on lectures by William Fitzpatrick, my teacher at the University of Rochester. He teaches an introductory ethics class there for which I have TA'd, and I'm basing a lot of these ideas on things he's said. So credit to William Fitzpatrick. Now, the evil demon objection says, what if we found out that God were an evil demon? Supposing the divine command theory were true, would we still be obligated to obey his commands? So imagine that God commanded horrible things like rape and torture and slavery to be moral, maybe even morally praiseworthy. That would be crazy, I know, but according to divine command theory, it would be possible for God to command those things. And if he had commanded them, it would have been moral, maybe even morally encourageable or praiseworthy to do those things. Now, this is an objection to divine command theory because it's supposed to point out a flaw, right? It seems to suggest that God couldn't make these intrinsically horrible things like rape and torture good or moral. There's something intrinsic and independent about these activities, those sorts of things in and of themselves, that makes them necessarily immoral. And even God couldn't change that. The divine command theorist, of course, can respond to the evil demon objection. She could say that God, by his very nature, is good, and so would not issue evil commands. That is, God is intrinsically good, so God couldn't and wouldn't make something horrible like torture be good or moral, or those sorts of things. So the problem with this response is that it assumes or presupposes that there is a moral standard independent of God, right? If God is intrinsically good, then that intrinsic goodness is fixed before God is there, right? Or it's at least independent of God. Right, so think about it. If God's nature determines that God is good, then that sort of goodness must, in some sense, be a standard that pre-exists God. It exists independently. It's goodness on which God's nature is based. And so that seems to, in itself, falsify divine command theory, because divine command theory says that there is no goodness independent of God. It says that God determines exactly what is good and bad. But this response to the evil demon objection doesn't grant God that kind of authority or power, right? His nature is fixed in such a way that he will do the good things, or he will command the good things. And so you can see how that goodness then, and that standard of goodness, must exist independently of God, falsifying divine command theory. Separate from those objections, I think it's really important to hammer home the idea that there could be other objective sources of morality. And these sources would give rise to a kind of moral system that's perfectly universal, perfectly objective, and I think really adequate for all of the theorizing and moral thinking that we need to do. So I say here that there are plenty of phenomena that are independent of our moral judgments that account for the wrongfulness of certain acts. They are, as philosophers would say, objective, wrong-making features of a state of affairs or a set of circumstances. So a really stark example would be lighting a cat on fire. Now, even if we thought that this was a morally good thing to do, we would be wrong about that, because lighting a cat on fire inflicts pain and terror into the cat, right? The cat is put through an experience of deep, deep suffering. It also ends this cat's conscious life and deprives the cat of the goods that it would have experienced if it weren't put to death in this way. So I think those are just objective features of the act of lighting a cat on fire, right? Sure, there is some sense in which the pain is subjective because the cat feels it within his consciousness, but it's still a part of this state of affairs, right? It's still, I would say, in a separate sense, an objective part of this state of affairs, or this set of circumstances. And it's an objectively and intrinsically bad part of this set of circumstances. So we don't really need anything else, it seems to me, to explain why it's bad and wrong to light a cat on fire. No appeal to God is necessary in this case. And I think this generalizes, really, for all, or at least most, moral phenomena. We can point to objective features of the world that make those things right or wrong. Now, I want to point to two final problems with divine command theory, two final objections, if you will. So the first is just that it seems clear that God's commands are incomplete on the sorts of things, or at least with regard to the sorts of things that we care about morally and that we have to solve. So, for instance, there's a big debate about Facebook nowadays and privacy online, what sort of information can be permissibly shared with profit-seeking companies. And there are really deep moral questions here about the right to privacy, about the limits of capitalism, and other such things. But the commandments of God and a lot of moral advice found in religious scriptures don't seem like they're going to help us with this debate. We need to do moral theorizing independently of those scriptures and independently of religious ideas in order to figure out what the best solution is to this kind of a question. Now, that's not to say that those sources, that is, scriptures and religions and religious thinkers, that's not to say that they're not useful in thinking about these sorts of things. Right? There might be some really useful information and material within the Bible, for instance, that would help us solve this debate. But it seems clear like it's not going to give us all of the answers that we need and all of the information that we need. In order to find those answers, we need to do independent, secular moral theorizing. The final objection to divine command theory is that according to those religious scriptures that we currently have access to, God issues conflicting demands. Different religions demand different things. For instance, Jews eat kosher, but Christians don't. That's just one small example of a way in which the guidance offered in those books and the guidance that's thought to have a divine origin doesn't offer consistent advice. So at the end of the day, I think we are forced to rely on our own moral sensibilities and our own philosophical reasoning powers in order to judge the contents of those books and come up with a morally appropriate answer. And luckily, if morality is based in reason and we have good reasons to avoid bad things and good reasons to promote good things, then there's a lot of hope for that project. We might use scriptures like the Bible and the Torah and the Quran to help guide us in this project, but at the end of the day, we have to rely on our own moral, theoretical reasoning abilities in order to judge and arrive at final answers. So thanks for joining me this time on Philosophy Jam. Don't forget to check out the discussion questions, and I'll see you next time.
At the river, at the river, at the river, at the river. Walter slides out on a branch, overlooking the tides, slithering along, nothing's on his mind. At the park with the family to find true happiness. The leaves are green,